9, 10, never sleep again. The residents of Springwood have lived in fear of Freddy Krueger for decades. When they finally tracked him down and burned him alive for his heinous crimes, they thought they were at last rid of him. They were dead wrong. Now the children of Elm Street are having nightmares about Krueger, and not all of them are waking up. On the surface, Weston Hills is just another home for the mentally ill. Underneath, it has a far darker purpose. Children exposed to Freddy Krueger are locked away, in the hope that erasing the memory of his crimes will render him powerless. When a young boy known only as J.K. escapes from Weston Hills, the worst is feared. However, everyone on Elm Street stops dreaming and a top psychologist is called in to get to the bottom of the mystery. Is J.K. connected to this phenomenon? Are the residents of Elm Street free at last? Will Freddy just lie down and die? Yeah, dream on. A Nightmare on Elm Street, Perchance to Dream, by Natasha Rhodes, narrated by me, the 80s slasher librarian, Joshua LaRue. Based on characters from the motion picture A Nightmare on Elm Street, created by Wes Craven. Prologue. How blessed are some people whose lives have no fears, no dreads, to whom sleep is a blessing that comes nightly and brings nothing but sweet dreams. Bram Stoker, Dracula. It was dark in the ward. It wasn't simply an absence of light. The darkness had a presence all of its own, the kind that lurked under the beds of small children and made grown men scream in the night. The room was as still as a corpse. A sudden shriek pierced the blackness, then abruptly cut off. There was a flurry of dull impacts, followed by a yelp of surprise and a wet crunch. Then all was still. Jacob shifted his grip on his weapon, warm blood running down his arm. Bring it on. Let's finish this. He could feel the evil presence watching him, waiting. It made him feel like a squeamish child, left alone in the dark with a particularly lively spider. Jacob's skin crawled, but he breathed steadily, strongly, channeling his nerves into the pit of his stomach. He'd been waiting for the moment all his life, and he'd be damned if he was going to waste it. Jacob held his breath and closed his eyes, focusing in on the sounds around him. There, to his left, the soft scrape of leather on stone. He spun around and lashed out with his broken chair leg, the only weapon he'd been able to grab before the lights had been cut. But the leg whistled through empty air, and the force of his wild swing almost overbalanced him. There was a soft chuckle, made all the more unnerving by the genuine mirth it contained. Jacob, he's behind you, a voice in his head said. He turned his head blindly, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The air moved, and before he could react, his makeshift weapon was smacked from his grip, with such force that his hand went numb. It clattered to the ground, rolled away from him, and was still. Silence. A bead of sweat trickled down Jacob's jawline, but he forced himself to remain absolutely still. He didn't need a weapon, yet. The floor was cold beneath his bare feet, and a draft whistled through his thin hospital nightgown. Jacob's breath hissed through his teeth as he fought to control his nerves, which screamed at him to run, to get the hell out before it was too late. But he was stronger than that. Only one thing mattered to him now, and that was revenge. The attack came suddenly, savagely, without a sound. Jacob yelped and dropped to the ground as something large whizzed over his head and clanged off a metal girder behind him in a spray of sparks, blindingly bright in the darkness. Shielding his eyes, he twisted on the floor and lashed out in the direction of his attacker, but he was not quick enough. A blow to his gut caught him off guard, and he flew backward and slammed into a concrete wall. He crumpled to the floor, coughing and retching. The inside of his head exploded and blew fireworks as a metal-booted heel connected with his skull. Dazed, Jacob clutched at his head and tried to get to his feet. The darkness shifted, and his legs were kicked out from beneath him with such force that he spanned 360 degrees in the air. Jacob saw an explosion of white light as he cracked his head on the cold concrete. There was a snigger in the darkness. Son of a bitch. He could see in the dark. He'd probably bought popcorn for this one. Jacob lay still a moment, his bruised chest breathing harshly as the unseen presence closed in on him. Blood dripped down his face and he clenched his teeth, fighting against the wave of dizziness that threatened to engulf him. As he lay there, the voices in his head started up again. "Who are you talking to, Jacob?" "My friend with the funny hand." "Mommy, why are you crying?" "Ha ha 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 ha!" Maniacal laughter rang through his mind, drowning his thoughts, stilling his sanity. Jacob took a deep breath, the laughter building in his head until he could stand it no more. A fury built in his chest, raging like molten hellfire through his body. Then his eyes snapped open in the darkness. Enough! He rose to his feet like a ghost. Before his unseen attacker could touch him, he let fly with the roundhouse kick that connected solidly, sending a jar of pain through him. Hands seized his jacket, but he smacked them away and made a lunge for the broken chair leg, scooped it off the ground and brought it up towards his assailant's face in one lightning-fast move. There was a screech of pain, and Jacob felt blood spray across his hand. Dropping the chair leg, he danced back out of reach, fumbling for the doorknob. If he could only lure his opponent out into the open, he might stand a fighting chance. Too late. Jacob cried out as an invisible force grabbed him and lifted him clean off the ground. The next thing he knew, he was flying through the air, tumbling, flailing, as he tried to right himself. He crashed into the shuttered window with bone-crunching force and fell to the ground in a storm of broken glass. The blind clattered down with him, filling the room with the wash of ghostly blue lamplight. Small dark shadows skittered away as the light touched them. For one moment a figure was revealed, a black silhouette against the broken window. Then the air moved and he was gone. Jacob groaned and rolled over, glass crunching beneath him. He took a shaky breath and pushed himself up on his elbow, his flesh stinging with a multitude of superficial cuts. He tried to get up. Pain stabbed through his leg as his knee buckled. "Motherfucker!"
"Jacob, that's supposed to be our little secret!"
Jacob clenched his fist as the voice in his ear turned to crazed giggles. The voice was low and growling, filled with icy malice. It was as familiar as his own. He'd been hearing it in his head since the day he was born. But even now, the mere sound of it sent waves of cold loathing through him. Fighting the pain, Jacob sat up and tried to bend his leg, beads of sweat trickling down his brow. He gave a cry of pain as his bruised knee made itself felt. The laughter in his mind started up again, loud and mocking. Jacob breathed in deeply, centering himself, shutting out the voice. He wished desperately for a knife, a broken bottle, anything he could use to defend himself. A long shard of broken glass gleamed in the moonlight. Jacob plucked it off the floor and weighted it experimentally in his hand, his eyes flicking around the room like a cornered animal. Then he pulled himself to his feet in one quick movement. The pain in his leg was bad, but just lying there would make things far, far worse. "Time to die, freak!" Jacob raised the shard of glass and waited, his heart hammering. His face was set, his strong, angular features locked into a mask of determination. Everything was in place. He could win this time. That sadistic bastard would finally pay. A sudden pain blazed up his arm. Jacob looked down. In his hand, the edges of the glass were glowing bright orange. What the fuck? Crack? The glass cracked in a sudden, searing heat that came from nowhere, splitting along its length with the sound like needles scraping over a china plate. Reflexively, Jacob dropped it. It hit the ground and melted instantly into a puddle of sticky liquid goo. "Shit!" Jacob clutched at his singed fingers, then turned slowly to face the shadows at the end of the room. There was something moving in there, forming a deeper patch of blackness inside the overlapping gray penumbra. Jacob peered closer, then gave a yelp as flames burst out of the window frame beside him, filling the window like a furnace, cutting off his escape route. He backed away, willing his voice not to shake. "I'm not afraid of you!" An echo was his only reply. Jacob peered through the blue-tinged darkness, his heart thundering. He lifted his fist to cover his face and dropped back into a fighting stance, ready for anything. All his training, all his physical and mental preparation, it had all been for this one moment. Don't die. He glanced at his watch. 6 minutes left. Then a noise in the blackness. Screech! Despite himself, Jacob winced. He could bear anything but that noise. Again, like nails on a chalkboard, he heard the screech. It was the sound of 4 razor-sharp blades being dragged across metal. Jacob clapped his hands over his ears. The screech became even louder. The sound was like a diamond drill in his brain. He couldn't stand it. "Stop it!" "I said stop it!"
And I said,
Jacob whirled and struck out blindly at the darkness. "Show yourself! What are you, chicken shit?" He bent double as a line of fiery pain scorched across his chest. "Ah!" It was as though a ghost had slashed at him with a machete. It was only a flesh wound, but the pain was agonizing. Jacob clutched at his chest, glaring murderously around him in the darkness. Then he cried out again as a second wound opened across his belly. Jacob staggered backward, lashing out blindly at the shadows of the night. Snick! A third cut ripped across his ribs. Snick! A fourth tore open his flank. Snick, snick, snick! Again and again his unseen attacker slashed at him, driving him back. Jacob powerless to fight him. He managed to catch one blow across his forearm and kicked out as hard as he could, but it landed in empty air. Jacob stumbled, nearly falling. He felt his head start to spin as he lost blood and knew exactly what it meant. He was going to lose this time. It was all too much. He had to get out of there. Jacob whirled and sprinted toward the door, blocking the pain of his knee from his mind. If he couldn't find something to use as a weapon, then he was done for. 2 more minutes and he'd have no more blood left. His numb fingers found the doorknob. He wrenched it open and ran out into the corridor. Outside was even darker than the inside, but Jacob didn't care. He flew down the long, dark corridor like a ghost, his bare feet slapping on the cold tiles, not even caring where he was headed or checking to see if he was being followed. It didn't matter. He had to get away, to try to remember the plan. As Jacob ran, he became aware of a strange noise. His eyes flicked sideways, then widened in alarm. The walls were bulging and warping as though they were alive, distending into big balloon shapes like giant bubble gum. Scary black shapes were visible inside the bubbles, rolling and turning and trying to solidify. Jacob turned the corner and entered the reception area at full tilt. He slowed slightly, panting, and glared hard at the walls. The balloons were setting into the shape of pipes, as though a vacuum formed in a factory. More pipes sprouted from the wall, racing away down the length of the corridor. Jacob jumped as a steam valve popped out fully formed, its wheels spinning furiously. He jumped at a sudden crump sound. All the lights came on at once, bathing him in a sickly red glow. Jacob felt a wave of overwhelming déjà vu scream throughout him. The corridor was turning into the boiler room. Fear shut down his mind, and Jacob started running blindly, desperately. Hot steam hissed out of the newly spawned pipes, scorching his legs as he ran. He sprinted faster and faster, his legs blurring into the darkness, desperately trying to outrun the pipes as they popped up all around him. He only had 2 minutes. The big green exit sign loomed ahead of him. Jacob sprinted toward it, not even daring to look over his shoulder. He ran across the foyer, grabbed the handle of the metal door that led to the car, and tugged on it with all his might. To his immense relief, it swung open with a creak. He was free. Jacob darted through the door, his heart in his mouth, terror fluttering wildly in his chest. He heaved the door shut behind him, then spun around, ready to run down the hospital steps and out into the cold darkness and safety of the night. Jacob froze. No, no! He was back in the ward again. Broken glass from his fight for life littered the floor, and flames danced through the broken window, throwing dancing shadows across the blood-splattered walls. As Jacob spun around and made a frantic grab for the door handle, an arm flashed out of the darkness and clamped around his neck. Jacob nearly jumped out of his skin. The arm tightened, and Jacob felt himself being dragged backward. Out of reflex, he slammed an elbow back and felt it connect with a solid thump. Heartened, Jacob kicked backward as hard as he could. The sickening stench of burned flesh filled his nostrils, and he felt the scratchy wool of his assailant's clothing pressed tight against his throat as the arm constricted his windpipe. Jacob gagged, tearing at it. The strength of his attacker was incredible, and he felt the world swim in front of his eyes as his air supply was cut off. He kicked and struggled, but try as he might, he couldn't break free. On the periphery of his vision, Jacob saw a flash of light, reflected off his attacker's glinting weapon. A dirty old leather glove with 4 deadly blades fixed to the fingers, like 6-inch steel claws. He knew then that it was all over for him.
Freddy!
Jacob's voice was a croak.
Say it 3 times. Go on. I dare you.
The voice broke into sniggers. Jacob felt the cold edge of one of the blades pressed against his jugular, and grew very still. He swallowed with difficulty.
Freddy, you sick fuck. That's Mr. Sick Fuck to you,
growled the voice in his ear.
Didn't your daddy teach you any manners?
My father is dead because of you, Jacob rasped.
Ooh, scary,
Freddy smirked.
Will he come back to haunt me?
He laughed uproariously, then fanned out his other hand, the one with the knife glove on it, and brought it up in front of Jacob's face, wriggling his fingers so that the blades caught the light. Jacob saw the reflection of 2 evil red eyes staring back at him, and clenched his teeth in hatred.
Go on, said his tormentor. Call it. Call your dear dead daddy. See if he comes to save you.
Despite himself, Jacob felt the threat of tears. He shook his head violently and swallowed again. Go fuck yourself! Smack! Freddy hit him over the head with his free hand. Jacob winced as one of the knives made a glancing blow across his forehead. A thin line of crimson opened up, and 2 droplets of hot blood slipped out and rolled down his face.
You better watch your mouth, my boy.
I'm not your boy, Jacob almost shouted.
No? Then what's this?
Freddy slashed open the front of Jacob's gown with the flick of his razor glove. Blood-soaked green cotton fluttered to the ground. Jacob shivered as he felt Freddy's cold steel knives trace over the letters that were revealed there, outlined in raised white scar tissue. 2 letters, an F and a K. Freddy snickered.
Most kids just get their mommy's names tattooed on a bicep. Something inside a bleeding heart, perhaps. Not to say that I'm not flattered.
Go to hell. Jacob's voice was like ice. He wriggled frantically, trying to work himself free of Freddy's death grip. If he could only get to the door.
Already tried that. Didn't work out for me.
Freddy's lips twisted into a malicious grin.
You, however.
Jacob froze as he felt the point of one of Freddy's razors pressing against the side of his throat.
I think it'll suit you, just like it suited your dear old papa.
Something snapped inside Jacob's head. Summoning the last of his strength, he gave a shout of defiance and broke free of Freddy's grip. Locking his hand around his assailant's wrist, he ducked beneath his reach and heaved as hard as he could, bringing the knife-gloved hand around to bear. Before Freddy could react, Jacob slammed his entire body against his tormentor's elbow, driving the blades deeply through Freddy's own black heart. Blood spurted, and Freddy gave a screech of pain. Jacob danced back out of reach with a cry of triumph. Finally, he'd done it. He'd killed Freddy Krueger. The world swam, and Jacob sank to his knees in relief. There was a loud crack and schlup noise. Jacob looked up. Oh, you have got to be kidding me! Blood spurted and bone fragments flew. Then Freddy was standing there, hands hanging downward, panting lightly,
and grinning in that hideous way of his. Fresh gore ran down his blades, pulling on the white tiling of the floor. He had pulled the knife out of his own heart, as though it were nothing more than a troublesome splinter. Jacob leapt up and stumbled backward, preparing to fight for his life. His body seemed to be getting heavier by the second, and he felt all the willpower drain out of him as he gazed into Freddy's evil red eyes, into the depths of his bitter, twisted soul. "Jacob!" Freddy's voice was sing-song. He held up a finger and slowly wagged it back and forth in front of his face. On Jacob's wrist, the second hand of his watch began the final countdown. 3, 2, 1. "Wake up and smell the coffee!" As Jacob's wristwatch alarm went off, Freddy brought his glove hand around in a powerful compact arc. Jacob closed his eyes as the center blade whizzed down toward his head, burying itself deeply in the light switch beside him. A blast of blinding luminescence stabbed down from overhead as all the lights in the room came on. Jacob cried out, threw his arms up to protect his eyes, and cowered back against the wall. He was vaguely aware of voices and the sounds of running. Then somebody screamed. It wasn't him. The screaming went on and on until Jacob dared to peek out from behind his hands, squinting painfully against the light. His jaw dropped. He was still in the ward, but things were different. He picked out the nightmarish scene in ugly fluorescent light. The ward was trashed. Every bit of furniture was overturned, and what wasn't broken was on fire. Flames crackled, and deep diagonal knife slashes ran the length and breadth of the room. The 8 metal-framed beds that lined the ward were empty. Blood was everywhere, pooled on the floor, splattered on the walls, dripping from the goddamn ceiling. How the hell had blood got onto the ceiling? Freddy was gone, and in his place a group of pale-faced kids huddled, staring at him in horror. One of the girls was screaming, clinging to her friend in terror. Utterly confused, Jacob took a step toward her, holding out his hands to quiet her down. Then he saw the bodies. There were 4 of them, slashed, gutted, hacked to death, floating in their own individual pools of blood, sprawled in obscene postures on the floor and across the beds. Young teens no more than 15 or 16. With the icy clarity of shock, Jacob saw that the arms and hands of the corpses were covered in dozens of cuts and slashes, as though they had tried to defend themselves. A screaming dread rose up inside of him. Jacob slowly looked down at his own hands. They were coated in blood up to the elbow. He was clutching a broken pill bottle in one white-knuckled hand. The world spun around him. Jacob dropped the bottle as though it had stung him, and backed away, holding his hands out as though to ward off invisible demons. This couldn't be real. It just could not be real. He had to wake up. The alarm on his wristwatch was still ringing. He tried to shut it off with fumbling, blood-slicked fingers, but it just wouldn't stop. He gave a shout of fear and smashed it against the wall, making the huddled kids jump and clutch at one another in panic. A deathly hush fell over the room, broken only by one girl's terrified sobbing. "Freddy?" Jacob's voice came out as a pleading croak. "Jacob, try to stay calm. We're not going to hurt you." Bewildered, he spun around to face the doorway. A white-jacketed doctor was standing there, one finger frozen on the light switch. His face was as pale as a sheet, and he looked like he was about to throw up. The ward door was hanging off its hinges, and behind him, the open doorway was filled with uniformed guards. They all had guns pointed right at him. Jacob swallowed as he heard the distinct click of a safety catch. "Freddy!" Jacob's voice was almost a shout. He looked around him wildly. The walls seemed to press inwards, and a wave of prickly cold nausea crashed over him. This was real. A tremor passed through him, and his teeth started chattering. This couldn't be happening. It could not be happening. It couldn't be Take it easy, Jacob. I'm going to come in now. Just stay where you are, and everything will be all right. But I didn't. I wasn't. It was him, damn it. He was here. Of course he was. The doctor's voice was so calm, Jacob wanted to slap him. "I killed him. But he wouldn't die. He was trying to kill me. It's all right, Jacob. He's gone now.
Don't patronize me, Jacob shouted. He's not gone. He's still here. I brought him here, and now he's going to kill me. He'll kill all of us. He saw the doctor exchange worried looks with the guards. One of them muttered something into a radio transmitter and motioned to the doctor, who stepped gingerly into the room, all the while keeping Jacob in plain view. Stay where you are, shouted Jacob, desperation filling his voice. Jacob, it's okay. Stop saying my name. He ran a bloody hand through his hair, fighting madness. I know what you're trying to do. You say my name a lot. You make me feel like I can trust you, right? I read all about that shit. Jacob gave a snort of laughter that ended with a sob of grief. Just go ahead and shoot me, Doc. I ain't going nowhere. We're not going to shoot you, Jacob, said the doctor, but no sooner had the words left his mouth when there was the thunk whir of a dart fired from a tranq gun. Jacob felt its stinging barb enter his neck, pumping out industrial-strength tranquilizer into his raging bloodstream. A moment later he pitched forward and fell face down onto the ground, a look of despair on his face. As he passed out, Jacob fancied he could hear faint laughter, ringing long and loud through his head. Then everything faded to black. Dr. Anderson wiped his forehead with a sleeve and walked cautiously toward the prone body of Jacob. In the corner, the kids were watching him, shaking wide-eyed. The doctor tried to contain his emotions with professional detachment. First things first, he had to get them out of there into the trauma center ASAP, to give them an individual debriefing before they started talking to one another. Contain the situation before any further harm was done. The last thing he wanted was for the news of what had happened to spread. Not after last time. In the corner, the blonde girl, a long-term patient named Kate O'Malley, wiped away her tears, blinked and turned to her friend. Who's Freddy? She asked. Okay, this has been the prologue, a little preview of A Nightmare on Elm Street, Perchance to Dream. And if this prologue is any indication of the rest of the book, I gotta say it's got me hooked. I love the way that Freddy was playing with his victim in that dream. It really seems like the Freddy from the movies. Maybe this author has got Freddy down pat. We will see as the book goes on. I hope this was enough to get everybody excited for Perchance to Dream. This will be the next book that we knock out here on the 80 Slasher Librarian channel. I'll be back tomorrow with at least a couple chapters of A Nightmare on Elm Street, Perchance to Dream. Until then, please drop me a comment below and let me know what you thought of the prologue and what you think this book may end up being. If you think it's going to be a great book, or if you just weren't impressed by the prologue. Let me know in the comments section. I'd love to hear from you guys. Until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80 Slasher Librarian saying, thanks for listening, and
Pleasant dreams!